Welcome back at WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. All of our Baltimore Positive pieces, along with my dear friend Don Moeller, brought to you by our friends at Taharka. He prefers the key lime pie. I'm not a key lime pie. I will be honest with you. I'm not key lime-ish, but my wife loves it. Arsh loves it. Don loves it. Everybody loves Taharka key lime. If I loved key lime pie, it has the graham cracker in it, so I go for the honey graham. That's more my thing. Also, our friends at Stay Fair in Catonsville and our friends at El Guapo across the street. Get on over to Frederick Road into Don's homeland of Catonsville. Get yourself some shrimp and grits and some chicken and waffles. We would be doing all of these segments there or at Fadley's down at Lexington Market, where we can still ship those crab cakes all over the world, including over to the Eastern Shore. When we get an opportunity to do that, you can learn more at Fadley's and Fadley's.com. Last but never least, we're selling homes. Moeller and Gary Realty on the scene. You can list it. You can sell it. Masks on, 6 feet away, the internet, and the lowest ever, 2.5%, 2.75%. Get on with Moeller and Gary and MoellerandGary.com. I'm going to get Jeff on to talk some Ravens with me next week, hopefully the 2-0 Baltimore Ravens. Don, we've gone round and round with guests, and you're the executive producer of All Things Baltimore Positive here for these segments. But certainly when I sent this over to you, you're familiar with Lawrence Lanahan's work, and you said, yeah, let's do this. Give me a little primer for you, because I know this is right in the series of all the things we want to do with Baltimore Positive, which is fixing Baltimore and things that have gone wrong in the past that can't continue to go wrong in the future, right?
That's exactly the bottom line, Nestor. And our guest this morning, former producer at WYPR, author, The Lines Between Us. And I hope when we're done, our listeners will say that's a book that I have to run out and purchase, because it addresses a topic that we've talked about over and over and over again here at Baltimore Positive. So, Lawrence, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thank you guys so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I didn't have the book to hold up, but I see the book behind you. So I always like to get the book in, or I can pull it up on the screen. I'm looking at it at Amazon. You know, your work came to me through others' work, right? So someone out on Twitter gave you a shout out. I'm not sure if it was Pam Wood or Brandon Soderberg. We've had them both on the show recently.
Yeah.
Antero Patia as well. May have been him out on Facebook. He's my Facebook friend now. So one of the things I said to Don 2 years ago when he's running the county is I said, look, I've been doing sports all these years. I'm sick of Trump running the country. I'm sick of criminals running our city. All of that. And I said, let's do conversations about how we make it better. And there's so many of you that have been at this for so long, while I was off running around, having parades and writing books on the Ravens and doing all that, doing the good work of things that have gone wrong and bad stories here, and stories that are not happy ending stories, and things that we need to change. And I guess if it inspires you enough to go into a basement and write a book about it, it's always something that I want to give some oxygen here. So first things first, the notion of writing a book like this and an audience to sell it to.
Yeah, I mean, it's just from living here. I grew up in Harford County, right? 18 years. I did the numbers when I started writing the book. Bel Air was 95% white when I grew up there. And while I was there, I just thought it was normal and almost like right, like the way things were and ought to be. And once I left Harford County and ended up living in Baltimore City for 18 years, it was like slow motion whiplash. And as an adult who is open to the experience of anyone he is living near, it was just the segregation and inequality was shocking. And once I became a reporter, I was an education researcher for 7 years, and then I became a reporter when I was 30. And it was the week I started graduate school for journalism was the week that Hurricane Katrina hit. And I just decided, I mean, how can you write about anything else? We love to talk around race and class in America. This time, an actual hurricane has churned it up. So that was 2005. I ended up moving back to Baltimore in 2009, working for WYPR. I felt like at least half the stories and interviews we were doing on WYPR, segregation and inequality, was the backstory. And I was just like, well, what if we made it the front story? What if we tried to have really unfiltered conversations about it every Friday for a year? Because, this is, and not just as like, look at Baltimore and all its problems, but like, let's look at this as a region. What do the suburbs have to do with what's going on in the city, and vice versa, so that no one is exempt from examining their own role in it. And so I called it The Lines Between Us. It was on WYPR. And with the word us in the title, again, I felt like no one was exempt. People would sort of be forced to examine their own, okay, us includes me. So, like, where am I?
You're in the story whether you want to be or not.
Yes, exactly, exactly. Yeah, I wanted this to be a book that would be on a coffee table in Sandtown and Timonium.
Well, for Don and I met Don on my first day of high school in 1982. Don was my high school guidance counselor, would go on to be the assistant principal and the principal and obviously county executive. We've been friends for 38 years, like literally. And when I entered high school, it was also his first time in Dundalk in early 1982. And I had never had an African-American classmate, neighborhood mate, schoolmate. I had gone through Colgate Elementary and Halliburton Middle without having anyone of color. Few Korean, few Asian. I was the Hispanic, and was not raised in a Hispanic household, and did not speak Spanish, quite frankly, gringo Spanish, So, but it took me until 10 years ago to scratch my head and say, now, why was that? What
Right.
was up with that? And I'll be 52 next month. I was well into my 40s, well into living downtown for a decade and having lived in White Marsh and traversed the city and, black guests, white guests, white sponsors, black sponsors, all of that, but never really looking back and saying, well, I watched All in the Family. I didn't realize I lived it.
It's not in a lot of people's interest in stable environments to disrupt the benefits that whiteness attracts, right? Like I think, Dundalk, Bel Air, places that are overwhelmingly white and middle class, you don't even have to be white to access the benefits of whiteness. The channels that allow wealth to flow to whiteness, and wealth follows whiteness, the channels were dug a long time ago, and we don't even see them. It's like irrigation. You're driving through the West, you don't say like, oh, look, that's taking water somewhere. You're just used to it. It's just the way things flow here. And especially in a place like Bel Air, like, even if there aren't that many black people to challenge however I'm seeing the world, the white people certainly aren't going to do it. And so I remember talking to Diane Bell McCoy about this from Associated Black Charities a long time ago. She said that this region has a very polite way of talking about race. And I'm glad you started off by bringing up your own experience in Dundalk, because, I mean, look, there are no black people in this episode, right?
Well, I
So
challenged the Republican last week in my world. A relatively angry Republican, a staunch, right? They always say staunch, right? I'm staunch. I need to look that. I need to look that up and figure out why staunch always comes. And it was about to get flippant, and I said, stop. Let me just give you my experience. I'm not judging I'm just giving what I just did for you. I gave my experience of being a Hispanic-looking 7-year-old boy in 1975 in Colgate Elementary and being the only person with any pigmentation anywhere near my skin, and that being my whole experience for the first 14, 15 years of my life, and how that would affect me at 52, how that would affect anyone. But we don't take the time to stop and think about it. I don't think anybody, but this has been that time, right? This is the time we stop and think about, well, let me just tell you my experience, not to judge your experience, and how that may make something in between us a little different, that we have to talk about it now.
Yeah, this is a boring sociological way of describing it, but we are all socially located. We are all entering any kind of interaction, whether it's a big institution or just another person that you've never met. You are coming from, your race, your class, your ethnic history, your whether you grew up in the country or the city. There's just so many factors. And in America, because of the way we, praise equality in this country, we have this way of sort of, burying all that stuff and just trying to look at each other as equal, which, as created, sure, but as treated, no. So it's like I'm saying, like with us, none of us three being black, I think it's appropriate for us to speak about our experience as being Hispanic, as being white, and what that means in this region, and examining it. And I think you're right. I think in the last 10 years, I noticed when I started the series at WYPR, I didn't really have any models. like a year's worth of conversations about structural racism and inequality. There were like a couple of radio series or newspaper series I had to go off of. And we are talking about it a lot more now. And with
Well,
social media, the power balance in that conversation has been reconstructed to a degree, and it is causing backlash. It is causing discord and chaos. Although a lot of people will call it identity politics, but I don't think it has anything to do with identity. I think it has to do with power. People's identities being used against them for so long, and now they have this back channel with social media to draw attention to oppression and injustices, and that's what we're working through.
A voice, literally a voice. Go ahead, Don.
I was going to say that our ability to have these discussions, and Lawrence, that's why I think books like yours are so important. And again, if you're just tuning in, we're with Lawrence Lanahan, new book, The Lines Between Us, really about the racial segregation in what he calls has been described as the most racially segregated city in the United States of America, Baltimore. And we're going to talk about how that became what it is. But I was struck by, as both of you were talking, we recently interviewed Lawrence, former or current Vice President Emeritus, we call him now, Kevin Byrne from the Baltimore Ravens, who's living happily ever after down in Hilton Head. But in talking about the whole racial situation and dynamic in the United States of America today, Kevin said that what he says to people who ask him about this discussion and get upset, whether it's Black Lives Matter or matter is the minimum, you name it. He said, if he'll say to his friends, the ones that Nestor's describing, that if you don't understand it, and he said, I try to say it politely, but that if you don't understand what is trying to be communicated, I can only assume that you have no Black friends, or you have really no close Black coworkers,
or you would sit and talk to them about
with
it.
whom you've had these discussions.
I don't know. I think you could have
isolated.
a Black spouse and still do it.
You do.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, you have they're just, excuse me, you have a vested interest in the amount of whiteness that surrounds your opportunities, right? And I'm not talking about all white places, but if they get too not white, people start leaving. They start going to their elected officials about, keeping schools zoned a certain way, keeping houses,
Well, you got a president of the United
neighborhoods zoned a certain way.
States telling 42% of the electorate that he will keep them away from you. And that's fresh,
Well, that's the great segue there, Nestor, to Lawrence's book that we want to talk about in some detail, because you talk about the history and then you segue it to what's different now. But one of the things that jumped off at me, and I'm sure it's why Nestor said, look, we got to get Lawrence on, because we've talked to Ron Cassie from Baltimore Magazine, wrote a terrific article in Baltimore Magazine about how to fix Baltimore. We talked about Antero Piatella, the legendary, groundbreaking work that he's done on housing segregation in Baltimore.
You know what Ron's good at? Sorry to interrupt you.
Go.
I mean, he can write about race, but he's also good at just not being like, we're writing about race. He can write about climate change or whatever, and all the appropriate context is there. I think that's so important in journalism.
It comes through. And what jumped out at me right away, early in your work, Lawrence, was the word intentionality. And I think people often miss it. And you said, we intentionally created white and Black spaces. Nestor likes to look at this as a civics class. Educate us.
Sure. I mean, and it's funny, I really tried in my book, because Antero's book is so good, so much has been written by historians about how the suburbs were created and how segregation took root in the city.
The real history, right?
Yeah, but I was like, how few pages can I write about that and still write a whole book about structural racism in this region? Most of my book is from 1970 on. And I spent, I think, 6 or 7 pages, and I'll tell you the history, but basically in 1910, Baltimore created the nation's first municipal segregation ordinance. White people could move to majority Black blocks and vice versa. The Supreme Court 7 years later, after everybody copied it in St. Louis and everywhere else, the Supreme Court was like, no, can't do that. So you have restrictive covenants, deeds that say don't rent or sell to blacks or Jews.
Which Piatella writes about in detail.
Yes, very much so. And that goes on until 1947. And afterward, even though the Supreme Court in 47 went after that. There's blockbusting, which Ed Orser at UMBC wrote a great book about, Edmondson Village. There was just like the sort of social norms where, the real estate board, would ostracize agents who were selling homes to black people in white neighborhoods. There was just this whole white power structure that shaped what went where, like, oh, we need, it's the 30s, we need public housing. We are going to, let's put a black project along Route 1 outside of Pigtown. Oh, we can't have white kids walking to school. So, okay, never mind. We'll put it in Sandtown. We'll do slum clearance and knock down part of Sandtown and put up some brand new public housing for the poor, which was seen by most people as a great thing then, right? Like, you've got slums, you put in new housing that people can afford. That's great, right? I have pictures. I went to the Baltimore City Archives and got appraisers' pictures of the houses they were knocking down in Sandtown. They look real nice. And even
what year was this?
Late 30s, early 40s.
Okay, so okay. That's where I thought we were.
Yeah, and so somebody in the Evening Sun says these are self-respecting families in pretty decent middle-class homes. They're not knocking down. It's not all slums. They're just like, we can't touch the white space, so we're going to knock down the black space and do it there. So, the federal government is creating 30-year mortgages for the suburbs where black people can't buy. They're putting public housing in poor black neighborhoods. They're building a highway, to get people to their downtown jobs from the new suburbs in the county. They're doing everything to create the channels for wealth to flow to whiteness and to penalize blackness and keep black people excluded from opportunity. Out in the county, there are like 15 or 20 enclaves, small enclaves of black communities. Oh, sorry, we're rezoning you from residential to industrial. Oop, and so you've got this situation where by 1970, they have the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights comes to Baltimore County, not the city, to have a 3-day hearing on suburban real estate discrimination. And everybody's got an excuse. Everybody's got plausible deniability. It's not bigotry, right, that they're seeing. This is structural racism. Even back then, Homer Favor, the local civil rights luminary, says and even in 1970, he's like, if you're looking for the explicit discrimination of the 50s, you're not going to find it here in the 60s. It's become more covert. And then the chairman of the commission is like, we've heard 3 days of testimony. We have this separate white and black worlds in this region, growing hostility and fear between them. Yet if the testimony is to believe, no one is doing anything wrong.
Well, this is 70, right? Nixon, Wallace, Agnew, right? Right around then?
Dale Anderson.
No.
Dale,
you know who that is.
Yeah, yes, wonderful. Hangs in the hallway where my picture. I said I'm in a rogues gallery there in Baltimore. I've got Spiro T. Agnew across from me, and I've got Dale
fertile ground,
a few down to the right. But Lawrence, you write in your book, and you really are capturing it beautifully here in this discussion. You say that racism is not a matter of individual racist villains, but a whole system of social and institutional dynamics. There's the social worker in you coming out in the book, right? What do you mean by that?
I mean, so the chair of that commission says in 1970, like, all this testimony is about zoning. It's really hard to get financing to build apartments, blah, blah, blah. That's why black people can't find housing in Baltimore County. And he says, no one is doing anything wrong. He says it sarcastically. I think today the way people say no one is doing anything wrong is I don't have a racist bone in my body, right? I mean, one, I've seen the x-rays, and that's not true for anybody. But two, you talked about intentionality. I mean, we define racism down, white people, right? It's got to be like you define it down to just below what you would ever do. And whether that's saying the N-word or like not hiring a black person or whatever, we all tend to define racism down, in the white community to absolve ourselves. We don't want to be seen as racist. People lose their minds when anyone suggests,
You know what's incredible for me is that veil has dropped the last 4 years, right? Like if you're wearing a red hat and you're doing that thing, that's sort of baked into it a little bit. But then to say, well, but I'm not a racist, but I'm attending a rally in Nevada indoor without without a mask, right?
But Nestor, I think that's consistent. And Lawrence, weigh in on this. It's an interesting point, Nestor. But
I
I
have
think
lots of friends in social media in my world that I know them. I know their name. I've known them for 30 or 40 years, and I see them proudly display their racism in my world so that I have to throw them out because I'm not going to have that in my pool, right? But the thing that I see that's so incredible to me is wearing it on your sleeve for all the world to see. And I think to myself, to your point, back to the beginning of the conversation, Lawrence, you must not have any friends of color because no one would tolerate this. And it's okay to be that way in your world. You can still be employed.
Yeah, but
you can still have friends and relatives.
You know Southeast Baltimore County, though. You know Southeast Baltimore County. There
Nestor
are plenty
grew
of
up
white
there.
people that hang out with black people, work with black people, especially like working class jobs are more integrated than a lot of white collar jobs. You have white people. I mean, look at Vince's Crabs. How many black people eat there? And look what that guy was saying on social media. I think you can have all the black friends in the world and still run around and do that shit. So what Don's talking about with intentionality is, you can actually believe that you don't have a racist bone in your body and perpetuate systems that create disproportionate harm to classes protected by civil rights law. I mean, that's the whole different. So one thing that's been happening at HUD lately is they've rolled back the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. They've just rolled back disparate impact. These are two of the most powerful tools to use the courts and agencies to prevent segregation. Like affirmatively furthering says there's a passage in the Fair Housing Act, that you should affirmatively further the act. And it's always been interpreted to mean taking proactive steps to undo the segregation that government caused, right? And disparate impact means if somebody's policy is disproportionately hurting people with disabilities, black people, whatever civil rights class it is, you can still, even if you cannot prove discriminatory intent, you can still take them to court. It's not as simple as like, oh, you hurt black people, you're going to jail. It's you say that policy is hurting black people, and the defendant says that is collateral damage, that is a side effect of a very well-intentioned and maybe even beneficial policy, right? Maybe you're just like setting mortgage rates or something and trying to be sensible or something, and it turns out badly. And then the plaintiff has the third burden of saying, yeah, but you could have done it this way and achieved your goal without hurting this class. So these are all like tools we have to get at that kind of structural racism, in maybe unintentional, maybe veiled intention of discrimination, and the Trump administration has rolled both of those back. And not only that, they're like trying to ferret critical race theory out of any kind of like government webinars. And what they're doing is defining racism down, that just so they can say, I don't have it in my heart. So nothing we're doing could possibly be hurting anybody of color.
Well, in recent interviews that have come out between the president and Bob Woodward, you get some insight. And again, Nestor, I think this gets back to your point. It's what makes it so complicated. It's why we're going to have Lawrence back on multiple occasions, because we're only going to scratch the surface in 30 or 40 minutes today. But in that interview with Bob Woodward, I think you gained some real insight into the president when Woodward basically says, do you understand that guys like you and me have had a privileged life, and that guys like you and me basically had a leg up? And the three of us would answer that without hesitation. Absolutely. I've seen it. I know it. I feel it. The president, and it's one of the few times that I think he actually was speaking the truth, he says to Woodward, you've really drank the Kool-Aid. I don't feel that at all. In the president's lens, he doesn't see it that way. So, Nestor, where I tie that to what you said, and we're going to have some real national discussion. Election aside, we've got to have some real heart-to-heart, Dr. Phil type discussions with our neighbors, with our about where we're going and what we believe in. Because
wait a minute, Nestor. Wait a minute. Run the country for 8 years.
Wait a minute. Yeah, but let's just quit for a second. making it all about Trump. Let's talk about what Trump has exposed, which is this great divide in our country between white folks, our folks, who feel in that 40-some% who feel so aggrieved that they put everything else aside, but at the same time they're wearing the MAGA hat, Nestor. This is where I quibble a little bit. I mean, Lawrence, I want you to weigh in this. I don't think the people at those rallies believe they are racist. I think if you were to ask them, are you racist? I don't think they say, you're damn right I am. I say, no, I'm not racist. You all don't get it. So I don't think they believe they're racist, and it's hard to call someone a racist because it's about what's in their heart, right? That's what gives me challenge all the time. Lawrence, weigh in on that.
Well, whether or not somebody is racist, I think that gets to be unproductive at times, right? Because it centers the whether the white person is good in their heart or not, when all the harm is happening in poor communities and communities of color. So when it gets to be about intent, and when it gets to be about the R word of racist, I tried to write my book without having a villain. I mean, a book about 50 years of racism in Baltimore without a villain. You know, you had to work real hard to be one in the book. And I think it's more productive to talk about it's like how you raise your kids, right? Like there's not bad people, kids. That's a bad decision they made, right? You look at the action, you look at the outcome, you look at the harm that is created. You know, is it racist to have single family only zoning? Is single family only zoning racist? Like, that's not a helpful way to talk about it. A way to talk about it is single family zoning disproportionately denies wealth building opportunities to Black communities, you know. And if, you know, are the liberals who are trying to keep apartments out of their neighborhood racist? I mean, to me,
well, is it racist or is it fair? Right? Is it just fair? The question you would ask a human is that fair? Is that fair? You know,
or just.
Or just, right.
Or just. Well, look at the issue, Lawrence, and I want to make sure, because I know you got kids to get to school and everything else, so I want to make sure before we get out of here, you do talk a little bit about a couple of things. I want you to talk about Barbara Samuels and the role that she played. I want you to talk a little bit about Thompson v. HUD. That's what I said. I know we've got hours here, but, you know, I lived part of this in Baltimore County, and when you talked about the intentionality, there were two issues in my tenure, both as chief of staff to two execs and then county exec myself. One, we ended up settling a lawsuit with HUD. You're very familiar with it.
Partly, and I'll put you on the spot, partly because of the 2015 Supreme Court decision about disparate impact. No,
without a doubt.
It says it on the county website.
Oh, I was just going to say, wait a minute. The number of meetings with the county attorneys and the HUD advocates and the NAACP that I had regarding that 2015 case. Matter of fact, so we don't leave our audience
lawyers
in
were
the
involved.
dust. So we don't get our audience in the dust. Talk about that 2015 case, why it was important. And yes, it did lead to the Baltimore County settlement that was long overdue. But educate our folks about that 2015 Supreme Court case, Lawrence.
Yeah, right. So disparate impact is a legal concept that I've described before, where even if you can't prove discriminatory intent, you can still have action based on disproportionate harm created. The class is protected by civil right law. And so it's been used for decades under the Fair Housing Act to make sure that people with disabilities, large families, religion, race aren't on the business end of policies that
back to your word of justice, right? So they get justice, right?
Right. So they get justice, and so you don't have to catch a racist saying or doing a racist thing to make sure that policy isn't being racist. And so I talked about this burden shifting thing. Is the final burden on the plaintiff to say, like, you could have done it another way, or is the final burden on the defendant to say, like, I wasn't trying to, I didn't mean to. Is that good enough? So there have been there had been some back and forth throughout the years of like, what is the burden shifting? Like, how do you do disparate impact in court? And so in 2013, the Obama administration's HUD wrote a rule and said it's the last burden is on the plaintiff, which some civil rights advocates thought wasn't strong enough. And so finally, HUD sets it. As far as the Fair Housing Act, this is how you do disparate impact. Texas doesn't like that. Texas has been sued for policies that put their tax credit-based low-income housing disproportionately in Black and brown communities, and they say let's go to the Supreme Court and see if they think disparate impact is even a thing, even a valid thing under the Fair Housing Act. Like, not just in our case, but can they wipe out disparate impact? People, they granted cert, they took the case, which a lot of people thought at least 4 justices were ready to wipe out disparate impact. Civil rights advocates were on the edge of their seats. And along comes Justice Kennedy in June 2015, and with some very bold language about integration of the Fair Housing Act, preserves disparate impact 5-4. I mean, it was really, people were on the edge of their seats Monday after Monday, because that was also when gay marriage case was coming down. So like, just everybody was going nuts about the Supreme Court, and that disparate impact thing got kind of buried. That means, like, if your county, Don, has been like, doing like pushing, back on apartments, pushing back on low-income housing, doing these policies that you have plausible deniability about.
Had a Dale Anderson somewhere in there.
Well, it goes back to the Anderson era, if you remember, Nestor,
HUD
when they decided
froze funding to him.
Correct, and would only put row homes, quote unquote, row homes in certain areas of the county. So the insanity of all this, when the county eventually settles, think of this fight for years. When we're talking about a simple concept, I think it's a simple concept, Lawrence, weigh in. To me, one of the things I would always argue, and boy, my boss is Jim Smith, Kevin Kavanitz, myself, all of us would get lambasted by folks, particularly in social media, about what we were doing, very Trump-like stuff, to the suburbs by moving to try to settle this case. And it was based, to me, always, I would say to folks, on a very simple premise. The concentration of poverty, particularly, is not good for anyone. It's not good for families. It's not good for communities. It's not good for the economy. And everyone deserves a fair shake. And if we spread out housing, affordable housing, throughout this wonderful county that's 600 and some square miles, we can do that. We can become a better place to live for everyone. And we literally ended up settling where HUD required us, and we in the Baltimore County agreed, to create 1,000 new units over an 8-year period. Now, 1,000 new units.
Plus 2,000 housing vouchers that could only be used in higher income communities. So because Kennedy made that decision, 3,000 opportunities opened up in higher income communities for low income households.
But think of how little, think of what a little impact that truly is going to have, that people had their pants on fire about. Baltimore County has 840,000 people. We're not talking about this massive disruption that the president would paint. And again, I'll go back.
But this is where Antero says, not in my neighborhood, right?
Not in my neighborhood.
Right?
And to the point, and Lawrence, you talk about, we talk also, and I give current Baltimore County Executive John Olszewski great credit, and the members of the council. My former boss, Kevin Kavanitz, tried to get source of income legislation passed. You're very familiar with source of income. We couldn't get it through. We fought hard to get it through. Johnny came in and he was able to get the ball into the end zone. So I give him credit. And Nestor, if you're not familiar with what that is, it seems like the simplest, to me, Lawrence, of all concepts. It simply says that if you have a government guaranteed housing voucher,
or any government benefit at
any
all.
benefit,
if your
veterans
income
benefit,
comes from
right,
any your
disability,
source of income.
Social Security, disability. If you have any guaranteed benefit, it must be included as part of your income to meet income eligibility for a rental. Nothing could be simpler
Yeah, and it just
Easier.
means the landlord can't say, I'm not renting to you because of where
Right.
your income comes
Now,
from. That's
now
all. It
you would
doesn't
say,
force them to rent to anybody. It just says
correct.
you can't throw their application in the trash when you get it because some of their income comes from the government.
And Nestor, you should see the things that have been said about Kevin, about me, about Johnny, about the council members, and they've still, people don't understand this, and good for Baltimore County, as common sense as that is. I don't think we've still been able, have we, Lawrence, to pass it at the state level
Somebody just told me we did, and I just,
this past session?
for obvious
Okay,
reasons, I wasn't
I'm going to
watching the
check on
session as
that.
closely. But Anne Arundel County finally got it. Baltimore
Frederick,
City
I used
finally
to
got
say,
it. Frederick's had it.
I used to say to people in Baltimore County, guys, Frederick County has
Yeah.
this. You know,
Well,
it's not a bastion of liberalism. Go ahead, Lawrence.
well, here's the thing about it. Like this idea of like where low-income housing should go. It is, in the city, people welcome that investment, like low-income housing. Like, oh, you want to put brand new housing that is good quality here where all these poor people are, that's affordable. Yes, we'll take it. You try to do it in the counties, and until 2014, they had a provision in state law that they could just get the county council together and vote against the application for the low-income housing tax credit and destroy the application. And the idea is that I am entitled to have a community that does not have any low-income housing and not think about where it's going to end up. To me, it's just like, if you want to do that, why don't you go try to repeal the Fair Housing Act?
Well, the president would like to do that.
Well,
I mean,
let's not offer a considered thought
yeah,
for somebody who's never cared
the
to
president
construct.
Vote. We got ballots are in the mail. They're coming in. This is time of the year. That's why we do this.
But I'll bring
Lawrence,
this back.
what's your time frame, Lawrence?
My kids start school in 7 minutes. So I'll offer this.
We're going to have to have you back.
I'll offer this one last thought. So the source of income thing, right? In a settlement, the county is forced to vote on source of income discrimination ban in 2016, and it went down 6-1 in a Democratic majority council, right? They were forced to re-vote on it in 2019. Same council except for one person. They need 2 swing votes, right? And they got the 2 swing votes, Kathy Bevins and Tom Quirk. All right, so that is peeling back a board of structural racism from our house, right? Like, we got rid of the source of income, this policy that created disproportionate harm, even if nobody meant it, nobody intended it. Okay, Kathy Bevins and Tom Quirk were under police protection.
Oh no,
During
they're both
during the hearings and the vote, because of the voicemails and emails they're getting. So when you peel back structural racism, white supremacy comes shooting out.
Both very good friends of mine. And both were treated horrifically. We'll have Kathy on soon to talk about it. She'd be terrific. Kathy, the threats that were directed toward Kathy in her neighborhood were outrageous and horrific. Hey, Lawrence,
and un-American, quite frankly.
Yeah, un-American. Before you run,
yeah,
and take care of your kids and get them to school, that's the most important thing. Can you give us a 2-minute primer on why folks should be aware of Thompson v. HUD and Judge Garbus and why it was so important?
Yeah, I mean, that was a lawsuit that basically the ACLU and some public housing tenants sued the city and sued HUD for just decades of explicit discrimination, white projects, black projects, putting the projects in poor black neighborhoods, doing tenant selection to put whites in certain projects and blacks in certain projects. And they said that the practices were not only continuing up into the 90s, but that they had an obligation constitutionally to dismantle the segregation that they had created. And they sued on affirmatively furthering fair housing. Like, you failed to take proactive steps to integrate public housing. And they did a partial settlement in 96 that created a lot of Section 8 vouchers you could only use in majority white, low poverty neighborhoods. And then it went to court, and Judge Garbus was a federal court. He only found on 1 count against 1 defendant, HUD. The city got off. And he said you cannot use Baltimore City as an island reservation for the region's poor. And he found only in 1 count, failing to affirmatively further fair housing because they failed to consider regionalization as an approach to doing public housing. Bob Embry, back in 1971, when he was housing commissioner, said there was a one-way street for the poor from the county counties to the city, because the city would take public housing would take anybody from anywhere. And Baltimore County, while it gained 300,000 white people from 1950 to 1970, it lost 1,000 black people from 1950 to 1960 and only gained 2,500 black residents between 60 and 70. So you had this like really structural dynamics creating the poverty in one place. And so they had a final settlement that created another 2,600 special mobility vouchers to help poor black families, because it was black public housing tenants were the class. It was a class action suit. So it reshaped the landscape of race and low-income housing in this region in a way that has not been approached in probably any other region in the country, but nevertheless hardly makes a dent in this area of segregation.
So folks have listened. They understand, man, I've got to go out and get this book. Lawrence Lanahan, The Lines Between Us. Where do they get it, Lawrence? This is your chance. Tell them where to go get the book.
Get it from Red Emma's, Charm City Books, Greedy Reads, Atomic Books. Get it from a local bookstore if you can. They might deliver. Black-owned bookstores. You could also order it from the world's largest consumer of cardboard. But I would support local business, worker-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses.
Well, we
Lawrence
hope you'll come
Lanahan
back.
is our guest. The lines between us, two families, and a quest to cross Baltimore's racial divide. Been an illuminating conversation about Baltimore City and Baltimore County. Love it even more when we can really drill down to making it as local, that people really it's one thing to hear about something in Texas. It's another thing to hear about something in Woodlawn and Dundalk, right? So
That's right.
we appreciate you, Lawrence. We'll have you back on.
Man.
Good luck to the kids, all right? Keep them educated.
I appreciate you guys. Thank you.
We're going to need them educated. Make sure.
Yeah,
Look at how good I turned out.
We're going to be
Don
clicking computer buttons for about half an hour, and we might learn something.
We are WNST.net, AM 1570. Don Moeller and I getting together and talking about good stuff here as we merge WNST Sports and Baltimore Positive, even in a football season. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore Positive.